of vertebrates. I keep mentioning this simply because as humans, we have sort of an inherent bias, and I would say a reasonable bias, to make ourselves seem important, to make ourselves seem like the largest group of animals, most important animals on the planet. And so what I want to keep pointing out is that if you look at things in different ways, certainly mammals, certainly humans are not the most diverse, they're not the most abundant, they're not the most potentially globally impacting organisms on the planet. So of all the vertebrate lineages, of all the vertebrate classes, mammals are the smallest. Of the mammals, almost three-quarters of them, 3,200 different species, are found within the rodents, bats, shrews, and moles lineage. So those account for the vast majority of mammals that are out there. Now, there are two characteristics that we use to recognize an animal as a mammal. Two things that we use to identify mammals and separate them from birds, from reptiles, from amphibians, from any of the other vertebrates. The first of these is the presence of hair or fur. Hair is a protein compound. It's sort of keratin-rich filaments that extend from specific cell structures called hair follicles, and these are relatively unique to mammals. Some mammals have hair or fur all over their body, including some humans. There are some mammals that do not. Humans, in general, have sort of this localized region of hair at the top of the head. We've lost a lot of the hair on the body, and the reason because of this is thought to be doing with signal recognition, communication with other species. So the reason that mammals have hair, it serves a number of different purposes. It serves as an insulation. It helps preserve heat. This is especially critical because mammals are endotherms, so they generate their own body heat. The more heat you lose, the more you have to generate. If you have some sort of insulation, you can preserve the heat inside your body. It's a way to preserve, not use as much energy. Certainly, there's some hair that we see that's camouflage. If you look at some mammals, they have very striking coloration patterns in their hair. It's used as a camouflage in the background to help prevent predators from seeing them. And then lastly, hair is also a sensory structure. If you take your hand and sort of rub it over your arm without touching your skin, you still feel your hand moving. That's because you're moving the hairs, and they can detect movement, so it's a sensory structure to help sort of detect what's going on in the external environment. The second identifying characteristics are the presence of mammary glands. Female mammals, all female mammals possess mammary glands that secrete milk to help nourish young. We talked a little bit about this idea of sort of K versus R strategies in reproduction, how R strategy produces lots of offspring with very little maternal care, and you just hope that some of them survive. K strategy, on the other hand, provides maternal care, and you produce fewer offspring, but you do more to try and ensure that they survive, ensure that they live. Mammals use this K strategy. One of the ways that we provide care is by providing food for offspring. Females provide the food in the form of milk to help nourish the offspring and make sure that they're going to survive over a long period of time. Now, there are some other characteristics that we see in mammals. They're not necessarily unique to mammals, so we don't use those as defining characteristics. I mentioned mammals are endothermic, so they regulate their internal body temperature. Endothermy depends on having a higher metabolic rate. You need more energy to maintain an internal temperature, to maintain an endothermic metabolism. Organisms that are ectothermic, that use the outside environment for sort of maintaining their temperature, don't need as many food resources, don't need as much energy. So because of this endothermy, we see the evolution of a four-chambered heart. This is a more efficient way to move fluids, move nutrients, move oxygen through the system. And these are all going to be required in order for endothermy to work. We also see a change in how respiration works. We talked a little bit about this. We have a diaphragm. Mammals have a diaphragm that creates a negative volume pressure inside the lungs when we want to breathe. So we are actually pulling air in because of a negative pressure. We'll talk about this more when we talk about the respiratory system. In addition to that, most mammals, not all, have a placenta. So there are certain lineage of mammals, the vast majority of them, that are called placental mammals. This is a specialized structure in females that helps link the fetal and the maternal blood circulation, so that the fetal blood can get nourishment, can get food, can get oxygen from the maternal blood. It doesn't actually connect it. Instead, what it does is it brings it in very close contact, so you have diffusion from the female blood into the fetal blood. Even though we have this placenta, even though we don't have, or most mammals don't have eggs, we still have remnants of the amniotic egg layers when we look at what's happening in the development within the placenta. Now, in terms of the history of mammals, they have been around for a long time. The first mammals evolved about 220 million years ago. They are around at the same time as dinosaurs. They were extremely small. Remember, mammals evolved from reptiles just like birds, just like dinosaurs, just like the other organisms we've been talking about. They're extremely small. They look very much like shrews. If we were to look at them today, they're probably insect-eating. They probably lived in trees. We can get this information from looking at the fossil remnants. One thing we also notice is that they've had extremely large eye sockets. What do you think this means if we see something with large eye sockets?
Nocturnal?
Probably nocturnal. So people have hypothesized that these mammalian or early mammal ancestors were probably nocturnal. Why do you think that might benefit them about 220 million years ago?
Less competition.
There might be nocturnal things, but think about what else is around there. What are these big things here that probably would be very happy to eat mammals? Dinosaurs. You've all seen Jurassic Park. They're perfectly happy to eat us. Coming out in 3D now. So if you're nocturnal, why would that benefit you from avoiding predation? Certainly there can be nocturnal predators.
Better for vision?
Well, the vision is going to be, with the large eyes, is going to be easier, but you could have predators that have large eyes as well. What is a trait that's going to be relatively unique to mammals that we just talked about? Last slide. Begins with an E. Endothermy. They're producing their own metabolic energy. They're producing their own temperature. They don't rely on external temperature. What happens at night? It cools down. If you're ectothermic, like reptiles are, like it's thought that many of the dinosaurs may have been, it's harder to be active at night. If there's not the ambient temperature to allow large levels of activity. That's why we don't see a lot of nocturnal reptiles. They need the ambient warmth, the warmth from the sun, in order to become active. So if you're this mammal and you want to protect yourself and you can be active at night, that's a great way to avoid a lot of predation. Certainly not all predation, but a lot of them. Now, mammals reached their maximum diversity during the Tertiary period, which lasted from about 65 to about 2 million years ago. So in terms of the numbers of mammals that were on the planet, this is when we saw the most diversity in the mammals. This occurred after the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. The mass extinction of the dinosaurs opened up a lot of ecological niches that were empty now, and so you can have a diversification, a rapid adaptation process where the animals that remained alive could fill these niches, fill these environmental holes that were left by the absence of the dinosaurs. They could evolve into the organisms that we see today because there wasn't already an organism occupying that habitat. Now, in terms of diversity, we've actually seen a decline in the total number of mammal species over about the last 15 million years. Now, we can't blame that all on humans. Don't worry. We haven't been around for 15 million years. But we have seen a gradual decrease in species diversity. So a lot of researchers, a lot of scientists have called sort of this last 15-year period a mini extinction event. It's that drastic where in terms of what we're seeing with the decline of species on this planet. So now mammals are divided into two different subclasses. The first of these are called the Protheria. These are the most primitive mammals. So in terms of characteristics that we see, we are still going to see characteristics that we use to recognize and identify them as mammals, but they're probably going to share characteristics with common ancestors. One of these is the fact that they lay shelled eggs. So these Protheria do not have live birth. That's why we do not associate live birth as a defining characteristic of mammals. That's not one of the two. The two are the hair and the milk gland, the mammary gland. So the Protheria are mammals. They have shelled eggs. The only currently living group of Protheria are the monotremes. So there's only one lineage of monotremes. There's 3 different species of monotremes that are alive today. The other subclass are called the Theria. This is the more modern lineage. These have offspring that are born alive. So we know we've completely abandoned the external shell process. We still have remnants of the amniotic egg in terms of what's going on inside the womb, but we don't have a shell anymore. There are 2 living groups within the Theria. We have the marsupials, which are called the pouched mammals. They give live birth. And we have the placental mammals. So in terms of the monotremes, these are the sort of the ancestral mammals, probably very similar to what one of the common ancestors of all mammals look like. They lay shelled eggs, and they have another characteristic that's very similar to what we see in reptiles. It's called the cloaca. It's a single opening that is used for a number of different purposes. It's used for extraction of feces, it's used for urine, and it's used for reproduction. So there's this single opening in the body that is used for all 3 characteristics. We see it in reptiles, we see it in monotremes, we don't see it in the Theria mammals. There are 3 living species that I mentioned. One of these is the famous duck-billed platypus. Everyone should be relatively familiar with that. There's also 2 different species of echidna. That's what these are right here. They look sort of like a porcupine or a hedgehog, but they are this ancient mammal that have the same characteristics that we see in the duck-billed platypus. So the next lineage, sort of the next oldest lineage of mammals are the marsupials. With the marsupials, we start to see this birth of live young. So it's a major difference in the embryonic development. Now there are differences between marsupial mammals and what we refer to as placental mammals, which are the modern lineage that most mammals are found in. With marsupial mammals, they have an extremely short-lived placenta. They still have one, but it breaks down very quickly, and the offspring are born very, very young. They do not undergo a long gestation period inside the womb of the mother. When the marsupial offspring are born, the fetus is still developing. And it actually crawls from the womb of the mother to the pouch that's found in all marsupial mammals. Once it's in the pouch, these are mammals. They do produce milk. Since the fetus is no longer connected via the placenta to the mother, they do still need to get nutrients and nourishment. So they latch onto a nipple and then continue this process of development. So it's a very early form of live birth. There are 334 different species of marsupial mammal that are found on the planet. The vast majority of these occur in Australia, New Guinea, and other nearby islands. Sort of the classic one we think about is the kangaroo. But there are a lot of different species of these marsupials. We have a marsupial in North America, it's the opossum. We actually have an opossum that crawls across our fence every night. My dog barks at it. I keep trying to tell my wife how interesting and unique and cool an opossum is because it's the only North American marsupial. I don't think she believes me. But it is the only North American marsupial. It is a pouched mammal. It's related to the other marsupials. It is not what we would refer to as a placental mammal. Placental mammals are, as I said, are the most modern lineage of mammals. These produce what we refer to as a true placenta. So during the entire period of embryonic development, the placenta in the womb is used to help nourish the embryo, to help nourish the developmental process. It provides oxygen, provides nutrients, energy, and so forth. Now the placenta forms from a combination of fetal tissue and maternal tissue, not just the mother that produces the placenta. It's a combination of the two. This is why you can actually then have this close integration of the circulatory system. If it was produced by just one, you couldn't have the circulatory system from the other grow into it. So it's combined by the production of both tissues from both organisms, the fetal and the maternal tissue, and then you have this circulatory system that sort of spreads through it maternal circulatory system to come in very close contact with the fetal maternal circulatory system. One thing that we see in all placental mammals is an extremely long developmental period. Placental mammals, relative to their entire lifespan, have a long period of development that occurs inside the womb before they have this live birth. Now, placental mammals, in many cases, when the live birth occurs, you have an offspring that is now fully formed, fully capable of surviving on its own. It will probably still receive some nourishment from the milk glands of the mother, but it's capable of movement, it's capable of defending itself. There are a few exceptions to this. Humans are one of those exceptions. The offspring that are born after 9 months of development inside the female are not capable of basically any sort of independent action. So most living mammals that we see on the planet today are within this lineage of placental mammals. If you look at them, this is a list of all the placental mammals. As I mentioned, the rodents, the shrews, and the bats account for the vast majority. We also have the carnivores, the primates, the Aerodactyla, the Cetacea, Lagomorphs, and so forth. So there's a lot of different lineages, a lot of different orders of placental mammals. Let's talk a little bit about ones that we are, primates. Primates are a specific lineage, a specific order of placental mammal that includes ourselves. So the ancestral primate gave rise to all the primates that we see, including our own species. There are thought to be two primary features that we see in primates that allow them to survive. It's thought that they evolved in an arboreal environment, sort of a tree-dwelling organism. And there are two features that we see in all primates that are sort of remnants of this ability to succeed in that environment. The first of these are grasping fingers and toes. We can all go like this. If you're running around in a tree, you don't need to have grasping fingers or toes, but it certainly is going to help to be able to hold onto a branch, to be able to hold onto a tree trunk. We see lots of mammals that are very successful that don't have this, but if you have these grasping appendages, it is going to be beneficial. So the first digit in many primates is an opposable digit. The definition of an opposable digit is you can use one to touch all the other digits. So animals that do not have opposable digits cannot do this. Makes you feel special, doesn't it? But if you have opposable digits, it means you can grasp, you can hold on to something. One of the digits can wrap around and grab onto something because of this first digit, because of the opposable thumb. We also have binocular vision. What is binocular vision?
2 eyes.
2 eyes? Yep, there's lots of stuff that has 2 eyes.
It says that we combine the vision of our left eye and our right eye so we could make it like one whole view. So like we could differentiate like this.
Pretty much that's it. It's the idea that we have eyes that are in the front of our head. The binocular vision means we can get a three-dimensional view. The eyes are shifted to the front of the vision, to the front of the face. We can combine these views from both inputs, the left and the right eye input, and get a three-dimensional image. Why is this going to be important if we're living in a tree? See predators? No.
Prey?
Not seeing prey.
See how far we're up or down?
Not up or down. Depth perception. If you're jumping around and you go and jump for a branch and reach for it because you have this nice handy opposable thumb, but then in reality this branch is 50 feet farther than you can see or than you can realize that it is, you're going to be in a little bit of trouble. Best case scenario, you might hit the ground and be able to run back up the tree. Not going to be very comfortable. So this depth perception is going to enable more accurate movement jumping around in the trees. So basically the binocular vision lets the brain judge distances very accurately. Now, as I mentioned, we're not the only animals with binocular vision. What's an animal that we see a lot that does have binocular vision?
Owl.
An owl, predators. Predators need binocular vision as well. And the reason is because when they're about to attack something, when they're about to lunge for a food item, they need to know exactly how far away it is. If they're trying to attack something and they think it's right here, but it's really over there, they're going to go hungry pretty quickly. So if we look at these primates, the primates sort of split into two different groups about 40 million years ago. One of these lineages are the prosimians. These are the most ancestral primates. So there are only a few species that are alive today. These include the lemurs, the lories, and the tarsiers. Most of these have extremely large eyes. They're primarily nocturnal. They have very good visual acuity. But if you look at them, you can see the two characteristics. They have the grasping hands that can hold onto the branch. They have the binocular vision. So these are characteristics that we see in the primates. The second lineage of primates are the anthropoids. These include all the monkeys, all the apes, and humans. Almost all of the anthropoids are diurnal. This means that they're primarily active during the day, and then they're going to be resting during the night. There are a few species that are active at night, but they are the exception. One of the differences that we see in the anthropoids is we actually see the evolution of color vision. Most mammals can't see in color. Anthropoids can. They're capable of discerning different frequencies or different wavelengths of light and able to recognize different colors. Anthropoids also have an expanded brain. We see, if we look at how they're living, what their living structure is, they usually live in relatively complex social groups. There are a few exceptions to these, but even these exceptions still usually live in pairs if it's not a large group. So we start to see the evolution of social interaction. We also see an increased tendency to care for young. Now we see this in all mammals. Mammals all have mammary glands, so there is going to be this care for the young. But a lot of mammals, once the offspring stops nursing, is not getting milk from the mother, then the mother stops caring for the young. Maybe not completely, but certainly she does not put as much attention into the young. Usually she's going to start trying to produce another offspring at that point. But with anthropoids, we see an extended period of maternal care that usually takes place long after the nursing stops. If you talk to some humans, it takes place 18, 20, 25 years after the nursing stops. So there's this extended care period that's very common in most of the anthropoids. One of the reasons for this is thought is due to their period of learning. Because we have a larger brain capacity, anthropoids are capable of increased ability of learning. So there's a long period of time that is going to that's required for the young to learn behaviors. They rely less on instinctual behaviors and more on learned behaviors. The brain is actually still developing in many of the anthropoids after the offspring are born. And so that is one of the reasons thought that we have this long period of maternal care. Now, the anthropoids are these different lineages. About 30 million years ago, they split apart again into what we refer to as the New World monkeys and the Old World monkeys and hominids. The New World monkeys migrated to South America. About 30 million years ago, they split off from the other lineage that remained in Africa. The New World monkeys are all arboreal. The New World monkeys, the majority of them also have a prehensile tail. So if you see a monkey that's in a tree with a tail, chances are it's a New World monkey. The Old World monkeys remained in Africa, and they're differentiated because they don't have a prehensile tail. Some of them are arboreal, but some of them are not. So those are the hominid line itself is separated from the Old World monkeys. The Old World monkeys and the hominoids remained in Africa, but they're different from each other. The hominoids include the apes and the hominids. So they're sort of split into those two lineages. The apes include the gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, and chimpanzees. That's sort of what we define as an ape. They have larger brains than either the Old World or the New World monkeys. They all do not have tails. It is considered a paraphyletic group, however. There are similarities between some of them and they're closely related to each other, but there are others that are more closely related to hominids. Hominids are closely related to the apes, but we're separated into a different group. The hominids include the humans. So the hominids are recognized by primarily a bipedal motion. We stand upright. That is one of the primary characteristics that we use to separate them. Now, as I've mentioned, with all phylogenies, this is sort of up for debate. There are many researchers who think that the apes should basically just be the gibbons, and that the gorillas, orangutan, or gibbons, and the should be the the apes should just be the gibbons, but the hominoids or the hominids should be the gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and hominids. Hominoid. So the hominids, which are the humans, they feel are closely related to the gorillas, to the chimpanzees and orangutans, and they are similar enough to all be grouped together in one group. But right now we have this classification where we separate the humans, again, because we have this inherent bias, this inherent desire to separate us from everything else, and so we place the humans in a separate lineage. So this is sort of the current phylogenetic tree. So we have the prosimians, we have the anthropoids, that's the more modern lineage. Then we have the New World monkeys, the Old World monkeys. Then we have the hominoids. Then we have the apes over here, and then the hominids, which include the modern humans. As you can see, chimpanzees could conceivably be put in with the hominids because they're extremely closely related. Certainly, the gorillas and orangutans have an argument as well. So what are the differences between the apes and the hominids? It's thought that the common ancestor of the two was probably an arboreal climber. As I mentioned, the hominids became bipedal. They started walking upright. The ability to walk upright is one of the defining characteristics that we currently use to separate those two lineages. Apes do evolve a walking mechanism, but they do what we call knuckle walking. Has anyone seen a gorilla or a chimpanzee or anything walking around in the zoo? What do? On all fours, but when they walk on their knuckles. They use that as a locomotion. They can walk upright. I see them do it, but they don't do it for very long periods of time. We have specific adaptations in the hominid body that enables upright walking. The human vertebral column is more curved than we see with the ape vertebral column. The curved vertebral column enables upright walking. We see a difference in where the spinal cord exits the skull. If you look at a human skull, there's a hole right at the bottom. That's because that's where the spinal cord exits. This enables the skull to sit on top of the spinal cord. We also see a difference in the lower limbs. We have sort of this cup-shaped pelvis that supports the vast majority of our body's weight. So we're capable of supporting the weight on the lower limbs. The apes, while they can walk upright, their body's not adapted to do that. If they do it too much, they actually develop joint problems. Of course, doesn't mean humans don't develop joint problems, but anyway. So in terms of the hominids, there's still lots of different lineages within the hominids. So these are some of the earliest hominids. The Ardipithecus was discovered fairly recently, a few years ago. It's sort of the most ancient ancestor that we see of the hominids, about 4.5 billion years ago. But if you look for Homo sapiens, they've only been around for a very short period of time. One of the things that I find extremely interesting about this evolutionary timeline, right now we are the only hominid that is alive on the planet. We're unique. But was that the case about 250,000 years ago? A quarter of a million years ago? Well, if you look at that, about a quarter of a million years ago, there were anywhere between 4 and 5 different hominid species alive on the planet. We're the only one that's alive today, but we certainly aren't the only one that's ever been. Hominids sort of derived from the Australopithecines. These were some of the earliest hominid fossils that we see that are found in Africa. The characteristics of these is that they all are very similar in size. It's estimated they weighed around 18 kilograms. They were relatively small, about 1 meter in height. They do show the same dentition patterns that we see in hominid health. That's one of the ways that we can recognize if something is a hominid versus a hominoid. We can look at what's going on with the teeth. An interesting characteristic is that the brains were no larger than that we see with similarly sized apes. It used to be thought that the reason why we evolved from the apes, or from a common ancestor of the apes, was because of our brain capacity. But if you look at our ancestors, if you look at these Australopithecines, the brain capacity is the same. The difference is this bipedal motion. We walked upright, and that is what differentiated us from the apes. Later is when we started to have the increased brain capacity. Now, within the hominid line, we have the Australopithecines, but we also have the genus Homo. This is the genus that we are. The genus Homo evolved about 2 million years ago. So again, we're talking about the history of life on the planet. The genus Homo is a fairly recent addition to the species. They evolved from Australopithecine ancestors. It's thought that the common ancestor of Australopithecus and ourselves was Australopithecus afarensis. Anyone here heard of the Lucy skeleton? This is what Lucy was, Australopithecus afarensis. In the 1960s, they started finding more and more hominid bones in near sets of stone tools in Africa. So they started to hypothesize, they weren't from the 1960s, these were fossilized. So they started to hypothesize that when we see the Homo lineages evolve, is when we started to see the increase in brain capacity. Because of the fact they found these tools near the bones, they called that skeletal remains Homo habilis, handy man. Why is he handy? Because he used tools. It was very similar to Australopithecus, but it did have a larger brain capacity. So while the evolution of the hominid line occurred because of the bipedal locomotion, it's thought the evolution of the Homo line, of which we are, occurred because of increased brain capacity. Now, modern humans, what we would sort of recognize as a modern human, evolved around 600,000 years ago. And there are 3 species that probably would be indistinguishable from each other if we were just to look at them, that we would sort of recognize as modern humans. One of these was Homo heidelbergensis. This is the oldest lineage of what we would sort of call modern humans. Not Homo sapiens, not the same thing, but it is a very recent similar species to us. They coexisted with another species called Homo erectus. Homo erectus is something that is a different lineage. It's still within the genus Homo, but we probably wouldn't classify it as a modern human. We also have Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals. These are, again, a very closely related species to us. If we had 2 of them up here, Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the 2. These were generally a little bit shorter than what we see in Homo sapiens. They were a little bit stockier as well, but beyond that, they were indistinguishable. And then lastly, we have Homo sapiens. Sapiens, just to show you how full of ourselves we are, we call ourselves wise man. So, as I say, we have the need to elevate ourselves, to make ourselves seem special. Certainly we are special. I don't see any other mammals or any other animals teaching biology classes or taking biology classes, but I think that probably makes us special enough. So, that brings us to the end of vertebrates. What we're now going to do is start talking about sort of the ideas of the animal body, the organization that we see within the animal body, and then principles of homeostasis, the ideas of how the body regulates itself. So if you look at the vertebrate body, and we're going to be focusing on vertebrates when we talk about the body and the organ systems, there are sort of 4 levels of organization that we see. We start off at the cellular level, so that we see different kinds of cells within the vertebrates. We already talked about this a little bit when we talked about the embryonic development. There are 3 different germ layers. You have the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. So those can give rise to 3 different cell types. But once we have cells, then we sort of move up to the tissue level. That's the next higher level of organization. From there, we move to the organs, and then ultimately to the organ systems. And each of these are classified based on what we use to identify them. Now, if you look at the actual different cell types, the individual different kinds of cells, the most basic level of organization, there are huge numbers of cell types, Humans themselves have 210 different kinds of cells in the body. That's a lot of different kinds of cells. You don't have to memorize them. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the general characteristics of what we use to recognize these different cells and what their purposes are. Now, the way we define a tissue is tissues can be comprised of multiple cell types. So when you look at the cellular level, you classify everything based on the cell type. Tissues are groups of cells, they don't have to all be the same type of cell, that share a similar structure or function. They serve a similar purpose. So they can be different kinds of cells that group together to form a tissue that serves a specific purpose. Now the three embryonic tissue layers are based on the germ layers. So we have these tissues that are starting off based on the germ tissue we saw in the embryo, the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. So as we talk about the different kinds of cells and the different kinds of tissues, keep in mind where these tissues might be deriving from. Do they come from the endoderm? Do they come from the mesoderm? Do they come from the ectoderm? Do they come from more than one of them? Now in adult vertebrates, we have tissues are classified into four primary types. So we have 210 different cell types in humans. Those are broken down into four different tissue types. You have epithelial tissue, you have connective tissue, you have muscle tissue, and you have nerve tissue. Everything in your body is one of those tissue types. Beyond the tissue level of organization, we start to have organs. Just like tissues are combinations of different cells, organs are combinations of different tissues that share a structure or a function. They form a single unit, a structural and functional unit. Please put the phone down. They share a single structural or functional unit that helps to work within the body. It may be different tissues, and certainly it's going to be different cell types, but they're all together. And then lastly, we have organ systems. Organ systems take multiple organs and they combine them together into a functional unit. So an organ system is a group of organs that work together to perform the major activities within a body. We have lots of different organ systems, and not a single organ system we have is made up of one single organ. The vertebrate body contains 11 primary organ systems that it needs in order to function. So if you sort of look at this organization, we start off at the cell type. Cell type might be something like a cardiac muscle cell. That would be one of the 210 types. We then use that to create tissue. So we might create cardiac muscle. Remember, muscle is a tissue type. The cardiac muscle, among the cells that will be found there, are going to be the cardiac muscle cells. Those tissues then work together to create the organ, such as the heart. The heart is not just made of cardiac muscle tissue. There are other tissue types there. Certainly the primary tissue is this muscle tissue. And then ultimately, different organs work together to form the organ system, such as the circulatory system. So when we talk about these different levels, keep in mind that we're talking about an integration of the whole. We're using these different levels to classify and identify things, but ultimately it all works together within the body. Now, the organization of the vertebrate body is what we refer to as a tube within a tube structure. So we have two, so if you sort of think about it, we have these two different tubes. There's one tube on the inside, one tube on the outside. The inner tube is the digestive tract. Where is the first opening for the inner tube? Your mouth. Where's the second opening for the inner tube? Your anus. The other end. So that is the tube. It goes through the entire body. The outer tube is the actual vertebrate body itself. So when we start talking about the vertebrate body, I want you to sort of be breaking it down into this simple idea that you have this tube inside this other tube. The outer tube is a little bit more complex in terms of the structures. We have a skeleton that supports it. We have different layers, including the outermost layer of the outer tube. The outermost layer is your skin, and as well as accessory tissues that are associated with it. So, but it still breaks down to this tube within the tube structure. Now, if you look at the vertebrate body as a whole, we can start breaking it down in a number of different ways. One of the primary mechanisms that we use to sort of split it up is looking at body cavities. There are two primary body cavities that we see within the vertebrate body. The first of these is called the dorsal body cavity. This is the one that forms within the skull and the vertebra. So this region is considered one body cavity. You then have the ventral body cavity. This is the region that's bound by the rib cage and has the vertebral column. So this is where a lot of the individual organs are going to be within the body cavity. So we have the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. The ventral body cavity is actually split by the diaphragm. I mentioned the diaphragm as it's aiding in the process of respiration. It splits the ventral body cavity into two different sections. One of these is called the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity is where you have the heart and lungs. Then you also have the abdominal pelvic cavity. This is where you see the vast majority of the body organs. So we have the thoracic cavity with the heart and lungs. This is primarily for respiration and circulation. Then we have the abdominal pelvic cavity where we see the majority of the body's organs. So if you sort of look at a general vertebrate here, we have the dorsal body cavity with the skull. We have the ventral body cavity, which is split by a diaphragm. In the one side, we have the thoracic cavity, and the other side, we have the abdominal pelvic cavity. So let's start talking sort of at the most basic layer about the tissue. The first tissue type we're going to talk about is called epithelial tissue. Basically, everything in the human body, everything in the vertebrate body, whether it's on the inside of the body or the outside of the body, is covered with an epithelium. It's called the epithelial membrane. It covers every single surface of every organ, every surface of every structure, even the surface of your cells. And the epithelial tissue can derive from any of the three germ layers. So it can come from the endoderm, it can come from the mesoderm, or it can come from the ectoderm. It doesn't matter what germ layer we're talking about, those can all differentiate into the epithelial tissue. Now, one characteristic of the epithelial tissues is that the cells of epithelial tissues are bound very tightly together. They're held very closely. Why is this important? Why would we care about this?
So like nothing else can go through?
Exactly. It's the surrounding barrier. It's a protective barrier. We need protective barriers to prevent flow of material in and out. So the epithelial tissue serves as a protective barrier. The first barrier. Certainly it's the first barrier of defense from the external environment, but even internally it serves to protect. Now, epithelial tissue also possesses regenerative power. Cells of the epithelial tissue divide very quickly and they're continually replaced. Why is this important?
So we won't die?
Well, there's lots of things that are important so we won't die. What's happening to epithelial tissue? What's happening every time you go like this? Sloughing off dead skin. Because it's on the outermost layer of everything on the body, internally and externally, there's always going to be cells that are going to be lost, going to be sloughed off. And so because of that, we have this epithelium that can regenerate very quickly. If it couldn't, if you did this enough, pretty soon you'd get through the skin, into the fatty tissue, into the muscle, all the way down to the bone. So we need to have this regenerative ability. Epithelial tissues are connected to the underlying tissue that's referred to as connective tissue. There are fibrinous membranes that hold the epithelial tissue in place. And because of that, it has sort of these two sides that are associated. You have the basal side, or the base. This is the side that's actually connected with these fibrinous membranes. You then have the other side that's not connected to anything, and it's called the apical side. So whenever you have epithelial tissue, you have an apical side that's free and a basal side that's connected. And this is very important because it describes an inherent polarity. There is going to be an association of specific sides. There's an inside that's connected and an outside that is not. And this enables the body to identify what to bring into the structures, what to allow to flow out, and so forth. It enables the body to keep sort of secure this idea of inside versus outside. Now, what we'll do on Wednesday is we'll continue talking about epithelial tissues, starting to identify the tissue types. If you have any questions, please let me know.